There are a lot of myths around this topic. So in this episode, I'm going to cover just a good amount of information around getting protein on a plant-based diet, and I'm going to set some of the facts straight, and I'm going to present some truths that will dispel some of the common myths, and it's going to be a great episode. I've researched some wonderful new information and facts, things that have really blown my mind personally, and I'm going to share those with you, and I think you're going to really enjoy this episode and you're going to learn a lot. So stick around and let's get started. Thanks so much for listening. I wanted to mention that any details, show notes, or resources you can find down in the description of whatever platform you're listening on. And I've also included my free whole food plant-based guide you can check out, as well as links to helpful and useful products that can help to support this channel. So any of your support is much appreciated, and let's get into it now. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was almost like this protein obsession, if you want to call it, or craze that we've been seeing here in modern times, especially in America where we live. I'm not sure what it's like in other countries, but I can only assume it's probably the same. And it really is, I want to call it like an obsession or a craze. It's always, are you getting enough protein? And foods are labeled as high protein foods. And, you keep hearing that you need to get more protein. And in my mind, I question where is this idea coming from? And the only thing I can think is possibly the meat and dairy industries, which, their businesses, they have lobbyists, and, it's a for-profit industry. They need to make money. And I can only assume just from, I remember growing up the years of seeing different ads. Now that I think about it, there were milk ads. If you remember the milk does a body good. There were plenty of meat ads. There was beef, it's what's for dinner, if you remember that one. So there was definitely advertising going on. There was a need to create like a demand there for these industries. And in my mind, that there's also the supplement industry too. They sell the protein powders, like the whey protein. And that's just really a byproduct of making cheese. So you can either throw it away, throw the whey powder away, or you can try to repackage it and sell it. So obviously it seems like you will need to convince people that they need protein, and they need more protein, in order to sell these products and these foods. It's interesting because I was looking at a peer review, and it was showing that the truth is people are getting twice as much protein nowadays in modern times than they actually need. And we are getting way more protein than we ever have in history. So it's just so ironic, and that's why I call it almost like this craze or obsession. It's just so ironic that there's such an emphasis on getting more protein when the reality is that we're getting plenty of protein, and we're actually getting twice as much protein than we even need. So it doesn't make sense. So really all I can assume is that it's these industries, these lobbyists have maybe planted certain ideas over the years. I know, like with my wife's parents, whenever they visit and the kids are eating food, the question is always like, what's their protein? Give them something with higher protein. They need something for protein. There's just like this constant fixation and obsession with protein, and you got to wonder, like, where has this idea come from? in our society. But that's my thoughts on where this might be coming from. If you have any better ideas or you know a little bit more, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear that. And let's look at the next topic. All right, so now we have this idea that we need more protein, right? Even though we don't. And then the next idea that's been kind of a common myth that we're seeing a lot of is the idea that your protein only comes from, you know, sources like dairy and meat and eggs, or that's your major source of protein intake. And, you know, plant-based foods just basically have no protein in them, or they're not even considered for protein. And, you know, there's like a small amount of truth to that in the sense that meat and dairy, at least especially with meat, does have higher levels of protein per ounce or however much you're eating. But at the same time, plant-based foods actually have tons of protein, and that's what I came to find out. And when you're eating plant-based foods throughout the day, it all adds up, and you're getting, you know, all the protein that you need, or just as much protein if you ate, you know, a piece of meat or whatnot. So there's a big myth surrounding all of that. I know, like, my wife's father doesn't really understand the idea that soy milk has the same amount of protein as regular milk, but it does. You know, it's entirely from plants. But look at the soy protein was actually sold and is still sold to bodybuilders as a protein supplement, soy protein powder, because it's got tons of protein in soy. And it's considered a high protein food, in fact. And there's so many plant-based foods that actually have lots of protein that most people don't realize, because they've generally been labeled as like carbs or fat. You know, so you've got beans and nuts, for example. As I mentioned, tofu or soy is extremely high in protein, and you've got a lot of newer foods on the market like quinoa is increasing in popularity. That's got a lot of protein. And just even common foods that you wouldn't even think, like rice. Rice has some protein. Oatmeal has protein, a medium amount of protein in those foods. And those are commonly just been, you know, known as carb foods. But if you look at it, it's actually got protein in them. I thought this was so surprising. I never realized this, but vegetables even have protein. If you take a frozen bag of broccoli, or I guess it doesn't have to be frozen, just a fresh bag, if you have one that's got the nutrition label, broccoli, peas, any of that, and you actually look at the nutrition label, you will see that there's protein there. And like, when I first saw that, I was like, what? I was like, my mind was blown. Like, I never thought you get protein from vegetables, because you never hear that growing up. You know, I actually worked in the bodybuilding industry when I was young, and it was always like, you know, meat, eggs, dairy, and protein powder. That's what you gotta eat to get protein. And things like vegetables were never considered to be a source of protein. Never. So when I saw that protein is in all of these foods which were commonly labeled as like carb foods and vegetables and rice, I was just like amazed. I was literally amazed. And yeah, it's astounding. And I think most people don't know that. I know I didn't know that for a long time. And even fruit has protein, although for fruit it's a really low level. It's, you know, maybe like 1 gram of protein or less. But it's interesting because all foods actually have protein in them. And that kind of leads into the next topic of, if you look at animals in the wild and you find that there's animals that eat only plants, the next question is, well, how, herbivores basically, the next question is, how are these animals getting their protein if they're only eating plants? And if plants don't have any protein or enough protein, or they don't have all the quote unquote, essential amino acids, all those things that gets thrown around, there are animals that eat nothing but plants and they get all the protein they need. And we're not talking about like weak and small animals or sloths or, bugs or anything like that. I'm talking about some of the strongest, like fastest animals are plant-based and don't eat any kind of meat. They just eat plants. So like the gorilla, that's an example of a plant-based animal. And all they eat is plants, and gorillas are huge. Like they're just insanely muscular and strong. So they're getting all of this protein from, the leaves and whatnot that they're eating throughout the day. And bulls and cows are exactly the same way. Horses are extremely muscular and strong and fast. And they're just eating, hay and grass, and they're getting all the protein they need. So like when I saw that, again, like the light bulb went off. And it said, okay, so these foods are obviously giving enough protein for not only these animals to survive, but also to be strong and just extremely fast and healthy. And so as humans, we should be able to do the same, right? Now, like the next thought that came to my mind was, okay, you could maybe say that these animals have like a different digestive system. So maybe they're able to extract the protein from these foods that humans would not be able to. Okay, that's a reasonable question. Although, in the case of gorillas, those are probably the closest animals in terms of like the digestive system and structure that are most closely related to humans, and they eat nothing but plants, and they do fine. But let's just say, yeah, maybe there's something going on there. Maybe they have a different kind of digestive system we don't know about, right? Well, there's an answer to that I found, though, and that's we have studies and we have communities of people who are completely plant-based. And we can look at these people and see that they are not only surviving, but they're thriving. Like these actually end up being some of the healthiest people and the longest living groups of people on the planet. One of the studies that uncovered this to me was the Blue Zones study, and there's like a book around it, and it's this research that found the longest living groups of people, and it studied, basically what are they doing for their health and longevity. And I'll be fair, like it looked at a lot of different factors. It wasn't just like one factor. They exercise, they have communities of people, they're very social. But one of the things they did have in common was the fact that they were plant-based societies. All of them were plant-based societies. And this is, I can't remember if there's 5 or 7 groups, something along those lines. There was the Okinawa Japanese people. There was there's an island in Greece. There is the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma, California. And these are people who are eating for the Seventh-day Adventists, they are completely vegetarian. And when they break down their diets, like I remember looking at the Okinawa Japanese, and they eat very little animal-based foods at all, like maybe 1 or 2% of their diet is animal-based foods. In the case of the Japanese, like they eat, I thought it was kind of astounding, they eat like 66% of their diet is just sweet potatoes. So that was like really eye-opening for me when I saw that. So this medical review I was reading looked at the Seventh-day Adventists and even those who were vegan, and found that surprisingly their protein intake was almost equal with meat eater or omnivore protein intakes. It was slightly less, but it was fairly almost 95% of the same protein intake from both groups. So I thought that was amazing. There were some groups that were a little bit lower. When you looked at some of the kind of vegan and vegetarian groups in other countries, they were still getting their recommended daily intake of protein. However, their protein levels that they were getting were a little bit lower than the omnivores. And maybe the reason for that is they weren't eating as clean of a diet, as a whole food, plant-based diet, as the Seventh-day Adventists may have been eating. And so what that means is, with a lot of the whole foods, you're going to, like quinoa, rice, stuff like brown rice, you're going to get protein with that. But if you eat a lot of processed plant-based foods, you'll probably end up with less protein, considering a lot of those tend to be sugars and fats that are added in for extra calories, but without the protein. So that may have been the reason for what we were seeing there. And another possible explanation given was that these people may have actually been dieting as well. They may have even taken on like a vegan diet in order to lose weight. So they were probably in a calorie surplus, and that was also causing a lower protein intake. And also what they found was that of all the vegans and vegetarians, there was only a very small percent or minority that was protein deficient, not getting enough protein. And generally in that case, the reason was because they weren't getting enough calories overall. So it didn't have to do with the type of food they were eating as much. It was just that they just weren't eating enough. So basically the moral of the story is, as long as you are eating enough calories and you are eating clean enough as well, even if you're not eating completely clean enough, you're still going to be getting enough protein to meet the recommended daily need for your protein intake. So all of that was kind of eye-opening for me. I enjoyed seeing that review. Of course, I'll post links to this in the description. Now, another common myth I see with the plant-based diet is the idea that plant-based proteins are not complete sources of protein. You'll see that thrown around a lot. They'll quote that they're incomplete sources of protein, whereas meat and animal-based foods are complete sources of protein. And it's interesting because some new research has found that that's actually not true. It found that all plant-based foods actually have all 9 essential amino acids. And those are the amino acids that your body needs and it can't produce on its own, so it needs to get those from food sources. And contrary to popular belief, plant-based foods have all of these essential amino acids. All of them do. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that, and what they did find is that some plant-based foods, or generally most all of them, may be low on one of the essential amino acids, and so it's not an optimal rate that you find of that essential amino acid in that food. But if you look at a different plant-based food, it will have plenty of that essential amino acid, and it may be lacking in a different essential amino acid, but when you take them together, they both make up for the one that was lacking, if that makes sense. So like rice may be lacking in one of the essential amino acids. I can't remember which one, lysine maybe. And then beans are lacking in another one of the essential amino acids. But when you eat, rice and beans together, and it doesn't even have to be together, just as long as they're both in your diet, at some point, you'll get the essential amino acid that is lower in one food will be made up for in the other food. So they all complement each other. The plant-based foods do. So it's cool. It's like nature. It works in unity and synergy. So, the only time anyone would ever need to worry about that is if you are just consuming one type of plant-based food and that was it. Like your entire diet, for whatever reason, you were in a famine or you had lack of access to certain foods and you were just eating like rice all day long and that's all you're eating, well, then that would be a concern because eventually you're probably going to become deficient in one of those essential amino acids. But the fact is that for 99% of the people out there, you're going to be eating a varied diet with different foods throughout the day, throughout the week. So it's not a problem. It's not going to be a problem. It's not even a concern. So that is a common myth and false believed thing about plant-based foods. And so when I discovered that was pretty eye-opening for me as well. And now another thing I've really found that just nails this idea home that plant-based foods have enough protein is if you look at all of these emerging vegan athletes, and I watched the Game Changers documentary with my wife, and that was really good. I definitely recommend that. That was like really eye-opening for us. What we're seeing are all of these new vegan athletes who are just dominating or performing better than they were when they weren't vegan. And there's very popular names out there. Like Cam Newton, who's vegan. Like Tom Brady is most of the time, he's plant-based. A lot of Venus and Serena Williams. So we're talking about just top-tier athletes who are extremely strong and muscular and are competing at an extremely high level. And these athletes are vegan or plant-based, and they're getting plenty of protein, and they're, in a lot of ways, performing better than they had been. And that's not surprising. What I've seen and the research has found is that for vegans versus omnivores, when we're looking at muscle growth with athletes, as long as protein levels are kept at the same, meaning it's the same amount of protein intake, muscle mass is gained is basically not different between vegans and non-vegans. It's the same strength gains. It's the same muscle gains. And there's a benefit to being plant-based because plant-based endurance athletes actually are seeing better performance. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that Plant-based foods have more antioxidants. And when you work out and you exercise, you're creating, these things called free radicals. And that's like disruptive to your system. And you only get these, basically when you eat plant-based foods, you're getting the antioxidants that will come in and neutralize those free radicals. So that's going to help you recover faster. And animal-based foods don't have that. That comes from plant-based foods, right? So if you look at it, endurance athletes are performing better. Strength athletes, it's the same. So most athletic performance involves some kind of balance between strength and endurance. That's why most athletes who are going vegan are seeing an improvement and feeling better, et cetera, et cetera. And I also thought it was interesting. They mentioned that in that documentary that the gladiators were actually vegetarians, and they were known as barley munchers because that was their predominant source of food was barley. So there you go. Barley's got protein in it. And what also is great about this is that there's another myth out there that even if you're getting the same amount of protein from plant-based foods, it's somehow, quote unquote, not as bioavailable in your system. And this is just totally ripping that idea apart because it's showing that that's not true at all. And again, in this review I was reading, it actually shows that new science is showing, that's not true at all. Plant-based proteins are just as available and just as utilized by your body as animal-based proteins are, right? So what the studies show us is that, if someone is eating the same amount of protein, gram per gram between, and whether it's animal-based or plant-based, the muscle growth is the same. The strength gains are the same. What that shows us is they're just as bioavailable. It's not true. It's not true that you have to eat more plant-based protein. It's not true that your body isn't able to digest it or utilize it, right? That's false. Amino acids are amino acids. It doesn't matter the source. It's the same molecule. It's an amino acid, right? And your body doesn't care where it comes from. It'll use it the same. So that was another thing that I thought was really eye-opening, again, because, I grew up in the bodybuilding culture, and it was meat, eggs, and dairy. And the interesting thing about the Game Changers documentary is actually one of the executive producers is Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And he's like big on this now. And there are some vegan bodybuilders right now. There are one guy who says he hasn't eaten meat his entire life, and the guy is huge. He's a vegan bodybuilder, and there's numerous vegan bodybuilders. So we know it's possible, and it's being done as well, which is really cool. And it's really opening our eyes to the science behind it as well. And by the way, that vegan bodybuilder who has never eaten meat, he eats a lot of tofu. He gets a lot of his protein from tofu. Because, if you're an athlete, and especially a bodybuilder, and you're lifting weights, your body's going to have a higher protein requirement, but you can still get that from plant-based foods just as much as from animal-based foods. And like tofu is one of the sources I mentioned earlier, very high in protein. It'll give your body what it needs, right? And it's just as bioavailable. So don't be afraid of that. If you're an athlete, just jump on board. Your body will thank you. You do have to be more, I would say, observant of what you eat if you are a vegan athlete, because it is, like, for most people, especially who aren't used to eating plant-based, especially whole food plant-based, it is harder to get the same amount of protein, just because you're so used to eating, like a steak or something and getting like a whole bunch of protein in the diet. So you just have to be more mindful of your protein intake, but there's sources available, quinoa, tofu, they're out there. You just got to just pay attention more to what you're eating. Make sure you're getting those protein sources as well, and you can still hit the same numbers. And like I said, your body can recover faster because it'll be getting more antioxidants from the plant-based foods. So that will help to, up your performance level, and that's what these athletes are seeing who are going plant-based. So that's another good thing to know. Well, guys, thanks for listening. In this episode, I wanted to give kind of a big overview of the plant-based diet and protein and some of the myths surrounding that. Maybe in future episodes, I may choose to go into one or more of these topics in greater detail, especially if people ask questions or show that they have interest. Let me know in a comment section. And I hope this was just eye-opening and useful for you. Like I said, a lot of the stuff I found along the way. First with the Game Changers documentary, a lot of that stuff was really eye-opening for me. And then I did some other research, and then I found this medical review, and I just learned so many things, and my eyes were opened. And so many of the myths that even I had held for so long, because that's what you're just told, I just realized those are not true at all. And it was kind of amazing. So you don't have to be scared to eat plant-based or a certain way, thinking that you're going to become, malnourished or not get enough protein, especially if you're like an athlete. So that was really game-changing for me, no pun intended, to that documentary. So, guys, thanks for listening. As I said, I hope this was helpful, and stay tuned for the next episode. All right, catch you later.